Let me just remind you, church, that most folks who ask us questions these days aren't looking for straight answers. They want us to agree with them. They want us to change our views and adopt their views, and if we don't do that, they tend to get very, very angry. Think of Perez Hilton and the question he asked Miss California a few weeks ago over the issue of gay marriage, and all of the anger and rancor that have been generated because this young woman gave it an honest answer. But notice what Jesus does here. They say, Jesus, is it okay for a man to divorce his wife? You see, they want to debate. But where does Jesus point them? Verse 3. He points them to the Word of God. What did Moses command you? Now, how do they answer? He says, what does the Bible say? They answer, well, Moses permitted us to write a certificate of divorce and send our wives away. I mean, this is so slick. I don't want you to miss what it is they're trying to do here. Jesus says, what is commanded? They say, well, it's permitted. Jesus' concern is, what is God's intent? What is God's purpose for marriage? But they want to focus on their legal permit. What can we get away with in marriage? He focuses on what is right. They want to know how far into wrong they can go without going too far. Like two kids who are dating, who ask the question, how far can we go? By the time you've asked that question, you're already there. Because your intention is not to find out what is right. Your intention is to press the border, to push the boundary, to go as far as you possibly can. These Pharisees are looking for permission for sin. And Deuteronomy 24, they believe they found it. That's what they're quoting here in verse 4. Moses permitted a man to write a certificate of divorce and send her away. Now, when did Moses do that? Well, Deuteronomy 24, verse 1, I'll read, says, when a man takes a wife and marries her, and it happens that she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of the house, and she leaves his house and goes and becomes another man's wife. What happened? There's no command there at all. That's all leading up to a command. That's all preparation for a command that's going to be given that says, and she marries somebody else, and that guy dies or sends her out. The first guy can't remarry her. The law in Israel said, if a man divorced his wife, it doesn't talk about permissibility or why he did it, it just says if he does. And then she goes to somebody else, she can't return to him. Now we can get into why all that was within the law of Israel, but this is simply the point I want you to see. This verse was not a blanket permit for divorce. Far from it. It doesn't address that topic at all, but that's what legalism does. It finds the slightest thread and it latches on that to permit me to do what I wanted to do anyway. Notice a couple of things here. First of all, notice Moses does not command divorce. He merely permits it in light of sin. Look at verse 4. Moses permitted a man to write a certificate of divorce and send her away. Now, what was involved in this permission? Before God gave this command, men, and by men I mean males, held all the cards in a marriage. A man in the ancient world could divorce his wife for virtually any reason whatsoever. All he had to do was say to her, I divorce you, I divorce you, I divorce you. And she's gone. She leaves. That was true in the ancient world pretty much across the board. That is still true in many Muslim lands to this day. What that did was give the husband a huge stick to hold over his wife's head. She had to be very nice to him because she had no other options. You understand that a woman in the ancient world could not own property. She had to own it through a husband or a son. She was not able to work the farm because of the physical nature of the labor. She couldn't get a job because they didn't exist. And so she either, to support herself, had to become a prostitute, go back to her father, or find another man who would take her. And then if she did that and remarried someone, these sly devils would come along and say, you know, I never divorced her. That's her word against mine, and she's left. She's with this other man. It's adultery. And she could be stoned to death. He had all the cards in his hands. And so God, through this law to Moses, gave it mainly as a protection for the woman in this relationship. So that if for some reason the man did find a reason, good or bad, for divorce, he had to do it publicly. He had to do it openly. There had to be witnesses to sign his piece of paper, which means he better have a good reason. He couldn't do it merely on a whim. It was ultimately for her protection. It was a safeguard to marriage. But then notice what Jesus says. Even so, divorce was never God's plan. It has always been a concession for sinfulness. Look at verse 5. But Jesus said to them, because of your hardness of heart, He wrote you this command. Hardness of heart. Hardness of heart. Sclerocardia is the word. It pictures a heart that is shriveled and dried by sin. A heart that is hard and unresponsive to God, rebellious and self-willed. The point being that somebody has shattered the marriage vow. That's what's taken place here. Somebody has sinned by refusing to honor God in the home. That was the only time divorce was permitted. God permitted it, Jesus says, because of sin. Because of the sinfulness of the world, and sometimes in a sinful world, evil takes place within the marriage that is ultimately worse than evil to be produced by the dissolving of the marriage. Sometimes a greater evil makes divorce tragically necessary. But that's the exception, he says, not the rule. Think of a father, for example, who would abuse his children. You've got to get them out of that situation. Think of a woman who is persistently immoral, who refuses to honor her marriage vows, who makes a mockery of the very institution of marriage itself by her behavior. Divorce is sometimes justified in tragic circumstances, but here's the point. It is never a good thing. It is never something to be taken lightly, never something to be celebrated and held up as a live option. It is not commanded, and it is never seen as something I might choose to do so that I can get a better deal. We'll look at that more next week. But folks, that's why every divorce is indeed a tragedy. Every divorce is rooted somewhere in sinfulness. So divorce, Jesus says, is a concession to human sinfulness, an admission of moral failure somewhere, but not a command. Not something that we pursue. Now, back to our original thought here then, the whole point of this is marriage, whatever else it may be, is not just a legal issue. It is not something created by man. Therefore, it is not something that can be ended by man. And I know this is kind of academic at this point, but I want you to get this idea. When we reduce marriage to merely a legal issue, we cheapen it. When we take marriage and make it merely an issue of law, we cheapen it. That's what these Pharisees had done. They've gone over to Deuteronomy 24, and they've read the passage, and they've asked this question. So what does it mean if a woman no longer finds favor in her husband's eyes? Well, surely that's the reason he can get rid of her. Does that mean she's put on a little weight? Argues too much, no longer has favor to my eyes? Well, they were going there. One rabbi, Hillel, said, it means if she burns dinner too often, you can divorce her. Another rabbi, Akabah, said, if you find another more attractive, so you like the new one better than you did the old one, therefore your wife no longer has favor in your eyes, and you can divorce her. Well, they weren't all that loose. Rabbi Shammai said,